The music stopped the moment Lena Voss walked in, or at least that was how it felt to her, though nobody in the ballroom had actually paused a single note. 3 years of this exact walk across the same marble floor had taught her that the silence was only in her own chest, a private drum that beat louder every time she crossed the threshold of the Ashgrove Pack Hall. Damien Ashgrove stood near the far window, tall in that way that made rooms rearrange themselves around him without him lifting a finger. He was speaking to 2 of his generals, his jaw set, his eyes flat and distant, the same eyes that had looked at her exactly once, 3 years ago, on the night the mark bloomed silver across her wrist, and his own skin at the same instant. He had looked at her that night, just once. Then he had turned and walked away, and he had not looked at her since. Lena smoothed the front of her dark green dress and found her usual spot near the second pillar from the left, close enough to the room to belong to it, far enough that no one would expect her to dance. She had perfected this spot. She had practiced standing in it the way other people practice speeches. Her friend Nora appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of something sparkling, pressing one into Lena's hand without asking if she wanted it. "You came," Nora said. "I half expected you to fake a headache again." "I don't fake headaches. I get real ones, usually around hour 2 of standing here." Nora glanced toward the window, toward Damien, and her mouth twisted into something between sympathy and anger. 3 years, Lena. 3 years and he still looks through you like you're made of glass. "I'm aware of the math," Lena said, and took a long drink to keep herself from saying anything else. The truth was, she had stopped expecting anything from these balls a long time ago. The mark on her wrist still glowed faintly silver whenever she was near him, a small and stubborn light that refused to fade no matter how much she wished it would. It was the only proof that the bond was real, that she had not imagined the connection, that somewhere under all that ice, Damien Ashgrove's body still recognized her as his. His mind, apparently, had other plans. She remembered the night of her marking with a clarity that never dulled, no matter how many years passed. She had been 18, nervous in a borrowed dress, standing in the receiving line with the other new adults of the pack when the mark had risen on her skin like a brand made of moonlight. The room had gone silent. Every eye had turned toward Damien, who had gone rigid, his own wrist burning with the twin mark, his expression unreadable. He had crossed the room. He had looked down at her wrist, then up at her face, his eyes doing something complicated that she had never been able to name. And then, without a single word, he had turned and left the hall. He had never explained it, not that night, not in the weeks after, not in the 3 years since. The pack had whispered theories for a while, that he was grieving someone, that he did not believe in mates, that there was something wrong with her bloodline that only an alpha could sense. Eventually the whispers had died down, replaced by a quieter, crueler consensus. The Alpha King simply did not want her, and no one, not even fate, could force him to. So Lena had learned to attend these balls like a soldier reporting for duty. She showed up. She stood by her pillar. She watched him not look at her, and then she went home and lived her actual life, the one that had nothing to do with silver marks or cold alphas, the one where she worked in the pack archive cataloging old records and helped her grandmother in the garden on weekends and laughed, real laughter, with people who saw her. Across the room, Damien's general leaned in and said something that made him frown, and his eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the pillars. Lena did not notice. She had trained herself not to watch him watching, mostly because he never did. But this time, for reasons he could not have explained even to himself, Damien's gaze caught on the green dress and the woman standing very still beside it, and something in his chest gave an uncomfortable little pull, like a thread tugged from somewhere he had buried a long time ago. He looked away quickly. "Alpha," said Callum, his beta and oldest friend, following his line of sight with obvious curiosity. "You've checked that corner of the room 4 times in 10 minutes. I have not." "You have," I counted. Damien's jaw tightened. "I don't have time for this conversation." "You never do." Callum's voice dropped, quieter now, more serious. 3 years, Damien. She still shows up. Every single ball. Do you know what that costs a person, showing up to be ignored, over and over, in front of the entire pack? This isn't the place. It's never the place. That's rather the problem. Damien did not answer. He turned back to his generals, forced his attention onto the border reports they were discussing, the increased activity along the northern boundary, the strange scent trails his trackers had found near the old quarry. Real problems. Problems with solutions. Not the tangled, thorny thing sitting behind his ribs whenever he let his guard down enough to remember the night of the marking. He had his reasons for staying away from her. He had told himself those reasons so many times they had worn smooth, like stones turned over in a pocket, and he did not examine them anymore. He simply lived by them. Distance was safety. Distance was control. He was the alpha king of a territory bordered by 3 hostile packs and one increasingly unstable alliance. And kings who let themselves want things, who let themselves need people, made mistakes that cost lives. He had learned that lesson once, a long time before Lena Voss ever existed to him, and he had never planned on learning it twice. Across the room, Lena finished her drink and set the empty glass on a passing tray. The evening dragged on the way it always did, in careful loops of small talk and distant music, and she found herself counting the minutes until she could reasonably leave without seeming as though she were fleeing. A young wolf named Peter, one of the junior trackers, wandered over and struck up a conversation about nothing in particular, and Lena was grateful for it, grateful for anyone willing to look directly at her and talk about ordinary things. He mentioned the strange scent trails near the quarry, something he clearly was not supposed to be discussing at a social event, and Lena listened with polite interest while her mind drifted elsewhere, toward her grandmother's small stone house at the edge of the territory, toward the phone call she had gotten that morning from her grandmother's caretaker. Her grandmother had not been well. The caretaker had used careful words. Words meant not to alarm, but Lena had heard the strain underneath them anyway. She had promised to visit first thing tomorrow. She had promised herself she would not let work, or these balls, or anything else get in the way of that visit. She glanced once more toward the window, toward Damien's broad shoulders and unreadable profile, and felt the same tired ache she always felt, the ache of being tied by fate to someone who had decided, without discussion, that she was not worth his attention. She wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if she simply stopped coming. The thought had crossed her mind before, always fleeting, always dismissed. Attendance at the pack balls was not strictly required, but it was expected of every marked mate, a public acknowledgement of the bond even when the bond itself went unacknowledged by the other half of it. She had always told herself that showing up meant something, some quiet dignity in refusing to hide, in making him see her whether he wanted to or not. But watching him now, watching the careful way he angled his body so that her corner of the room stayed just out of his direct line of sight, she felt, for the first time in 3 years, a flicker of something other than hurt. It felt almost like relief, the relief of a decision she had not yet made, but that had already begun forming somewhere deep and quiet inside her. The evening wound down eventually, as it always did. The musicians played their final set, the crowd began to thin, and Lena said her goodbyes to Nora and to Peter and slipped out through the side door before the formal closing announcements, another small habit she had built over 3 years of not wanting to be the last person left standing near a pillar. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp with the smell of pine, and Lena breathed it in like something she had been missing all evening. She walked the long way home, past the old fountain in the square, past the shuttered shops with their painted signs, letting the quiet settle her nerves the way the ballroom never could. Her small apartment above the pack archive was dark and familiar, and she moved through it without needing the lights, dropping her shoes by the door, unpinning her hair, letting the tension of the evening slide off her shoulders piece by piece. She checked her phone once more before bed. No missed calls, no new messages from the caretaker. She told herself that was good news and tried to believe it. She did not know, as she drifted off to sleep, that across the territory, in his private study lit only by a low fire, Damien Ashgrove was staring at his own wrist, at the silver mark that had never once faded in 3 years, tracing his thumb over it the way he had done almost every night since the marking, in a habit he had never told anyone about, and would have denied under torture. He did not understand why the sight of a green dress by a pillar had unsettled him so thoroughly tonight, why the ache in his chest had chosen this particular evening to sharpen instead of fade. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself it was exhaustion, the border reports, the stress of managing 3 separate threats to his territory at once. He almost believed it. Callum found him there an hour later, still staring into the fire, and said nothing for a long moment, simply pouring 2 glasses of something amber, and setting one within his alpha's reach. "You know," Callum said eventually, "there will come a day when she stops showing up, and I don't think you're ready for what that will feel like." Damien did not answer, but long after Callum had gone, long after the fire had burned down to embers, he found himself still thinking about it, about a future evening with an empty space by the pillar where a green dress used to stand, and the thought sat in his chest like a stone he could not put down. Morning came gray and quiet over the territory, mist curling low along the tree line as Lena made her way toward her grandmother's house at the edge of the woods. She had left before sunrise, unable to shake the unease that had settled over her the previous night, a feeling she could not name, but that pulled at her with increasing urgency the closer she got to the old stone cottage. The caretaker, a soft-spoken woman named Edith, met her at the gate with a face that told Lena everything before a single word was spoken. "She's asking for you," Edith said gently. "She had a difficult night." Lena's chest tightened as she hurried up the path, through the low door, into the small bedroom where her grandmother Marta lay propped against a stack of pillows, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes tired but sharp, still holding that same knowing light they always had. "There you are," Marta said, her voice thin but warm. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your old grandmother." "Never," Lena said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and taking her grandmother's hand. "I came as soon as I heard." Marta's fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "Good, because there are things I need to tell you, and I find I no longer have the luxury of waiting for a better day." Something in her grandmother's tone made the hair on Lena's arms rise, a seriousness that went beyond illness, beyond the ordinary fears of a family gathered at a sickbed. She leaned closer, and Marta began to speak, her voice low and steady, weaving a story Lena had never heard before, about bloodlines older than the Ashgrove pack itself, about a gift buried so deep in their family line that even Marta had only ever seen its shadow. Lena listened, her heart pounding, the ballroom and the pillar and Damien Ashgrove's cold, distant eyes fading entirely from her mind as her grandmother's words rearranged everything she thought she knew about herself. By the time the mist burned off outside the window, Lena Voss was no longer entirely certain who she was. Marta did not stop at the first revelation. She gathered her breath, adjusted the pillows behind her, and continued, as though she had been saving these words for exactly this moment and would not be denied the chance to finish. "Our family," she said, "was never meant to be ordinary. Long before the Ashgrove line rose to power, before the packs drew their borders and built their halls, there were bloodlines that carried something older than alpha strength, not the ability to command wolves. Something quieter, something the founding packs feared enough to bury out of their own histories." Lena's fingers tightened around her grandmother's hand. "Feared how? The gift moves through blood, skipping generations sometimes, sleeping for decades. It surfaces only when it is needed, and only in someone strong enough to survive carrying it. I always suspected it might choose you. I saw the way you carried yourself even as a child, the way animals went quiet around you, the way storms seemed to soften near our house. I told myself I was imagining things. Old women imagine things. What is it? The gift, I mean. What does it actually do?" Marta's eyes clouded, not with confusion, but with the particular caution of someone deciding how much truth a person could hold at once. "I do not know its full shape. My own mother only ever showed me fragments, and she died before she could teach me more. What I know is this. It is tied to the founding of the packs, to an old balance that was broken generations ago, and it does not stay hidden forever." Lena sat with that for a long moment, the quiet room pressing in around her, the smell of dried herbs and wood smoke that had always meant safety now carrying an edge of something unfamiliar. "Why tell me this now?" she finally asked. "Why not years ago?" "Because I was afraid," Marta said simply. "Afraid of what it would mean for you. Afraid of the packs that might come looking for a girl with old blood. Afraid most of all that telling you too soon would make you reckless with something too large for a young heart to carry carefully. But I am running out of days to be afraid on your behalf, Lena. You deserve to know what you are, even if I cannot tell you everything." The conversation drained something out of both of them, and Marta's eyes grew heavy not long after, sleep pulling her under mid-sentence the way it had begun to more and more in recent weeks. Lena sat beside the bed for a long while after her grandmother had drifted off, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, turning the strange new knowledge over in her mind like a stone she did not yet know how to hold. Edith found her there an hour later and gently suggested she get some fresh air, that sitting in a sick room all day would do neither of them any good. Lena stepped outside into a morning that had brightened considerably, the mist burned away, sunlight slanting gold through the trees, and found herself walking without any particular destination, her thoughts too loud for the small cottage. She did not go back to the pack hall that day. She did not think about ballrooms or pillars or silver marks at all, not once, and there was something almost peaceful in that, a version of her life that had nothing to do with Damien Ashgrove's indifference. That peace did not last past sundown. News traveled fast within pack territory, faster than most people expected, and by the time Lena returned to her apartment that evening, exhausted and hollowed out from the weight of her grandmother's words, 3 separate messages waited on her phone from people asking the same question in slightly different words. Where had she been at the ball? She had not thought, not once, about the fact that the second monthly gathering had taken place that very evening. that she had simply not gone, that for the first time in 3 years she had missed one entirely without meaning to make any kind of statement out of it. She sat on the edge of her bed and read the messages twice, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not guilt, not the anxious need to explain herself. Something closer to surprise at how little the absence had cost her, how the sky had not fallen, how nothing catastrophic had happened, simply because Lena Voss had not stood by her pillar for one single evening. Across the territory, in the same ballroom that had hosted 3 years of quiet humiliation, Damien Ashgrove had noticed the empty space by the second pillar within the first 10 minutes of arriving, and had spent the rest of the evening in a state of distraction so obvious that even his generals had begun to comment on it. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself 100 reasons why a person might miss a single gathering: illness, exhaustion, simple disinterest in an event she had never seemed to particularly enjoy attending in the first place. He told himself these things while his eyes kept drifting, uselessly, toward the empty corner of the room, and by the time the evening ended he had convinced himself of nothing at all except a low, persistent unease that followed him home and refused to let him sleep. "You're doing it again," Callum said the next morning, finding his Alpha at the same desk, staring at the same reports he had failed to read the night before, staring at nothing, like it owes you an explanation. "She wasn't there," Damien said before he could stop himself. Callum's eyebrows rose, just slightly. "No, she wasn't." "Do you know why?" "I don't. Do you want me to find out?" Damien hesitated, and in that hesitation was 3 years of carefully maintained distance. 3 years of telling himself that whatever he felt toward Lena Voss was a complication his territory could not afford, that a king distracted by want was a king who made mistakes. "No," he said finally. "It isn't my business." Screen. Callum studied him for a long moment, an expression on his face that suggested he did not believe a word of it, but he let the subject drop, and Damien returned, or tried to return, to the border reports waiting on his desk. The scent trails near the quarry had grown stranger overnight, according to his trackers, unfamiliar and layered in a way that suggested something more organized than a rogue wolf passing through unclaimed land. He forced himself to focus on that instead, on threats he could name and quantify, and managed, for perhaps an hour, to push the empty pillar out of his mind entirely. It did not stay pushed for long. By the time the next gathering came around, 3 weeks later, word had spread through the pack in the particular way that gossip spreads among people who have spent 3 years watching a slow, painful story unfold in front of them. Lena Voss had missed the last ball. Some said grief, since word of her grandmother's illness had traveled too. Others whispered something less kind, that she had finally given up entirely, that the Alpha King's indifference had finally worn her down past the point of showing up to be ignored. Lena heard the whispers secondhand, through Nora, who delivered them with the particular outrage of someone defending a friend against an unfair world. "They're saying you gave up," Nora said, dropping onto the small couch in Lena's apartment with the heavy sigh of someone who had been holding this conversation in for days. "Like you're the one who did something wrong. Like 3 years of him not looking at you twice is somehow your failure." "Let them say what they want," Lena said, and found, to her own mild surprise, that she meant it. "I wasn't making a statement. My grandmother was sick. I had somewhere else to be. And this time, the next one's in 4 days." Lena considered the question longer than she expected to. Her grandmother's condition had stabilized somewhat, enough that another absence would not be strictly necessary, enough that she could, if she chose, put on the green dress again and stand by the pillar, and let another evening pass in careful, practiced invisibility. She found she did not want to. It was not defiance, not exactly, not the kind of statement Nora seemed to expect. It was simpler than that, and stranger. For the first time in 3 years, Lena had spent real time thinking about herself, about her grandmother's revelation, about a bloodline older and stranger than she had ever imagined, and somewhere in all of that thinking, the ballroom and the pillar and Damien Ashgrove's cold indifference had shrunk down to something smaller than they used to be, a habit she had outgrown without quite noticing the moment it happened. "I don't think I'm going," she said finally. Nora blinked. "Not going, as in, at all. As in, I have better things to do with my evenings than stand next to a pillar so a man who's decided I don't exist can continue not noticing me. I've done that for 3 years, Nora. I'm tired." Nora's expression shifted slowly from surprise into something like pride. "Good," she said. "It's about time." The 4th ball came and went, and Lena spent the evening instead at her grandmother's cottage, sitting by the fire while Marta dozed in her chair, occasionally waking to ask small questions about Lena's week, about the archive, about anything except the pack and its politics. It was, Lena thought, one of the more peaceful evenings she had spent in longer than she could remember. At the pack hall, the empty pillar corner had become something of a topic of quiet conversation among the attendees, murmured behind raised glasses, and Damien Ashgrove stood near the window with his jaw set so tightly Callum worried, briefly, that his alpha might crack a tooth. "She isn't coming," Callum said quietly, standing beside him. "I can see that. Do you know why, this time?" Damien did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost too quiet for even Callum to catch. "I don't know anything about her at all. 3 years, and I don't know a single thing." Callum said nothing, letting the silence do the work his words could not, and across the room, the empty pillar corner stood as its own kind of statement, louder in its absence than Lena Voss had ever managed to be in 3 years of showing up. The quarry sat 2 miles north of the last farmhouse in Ashgrove territory, a scarred bowl of gray stone that had been abandoned for generations, and it was there that Damien Ashgrove found himself standing at dawn, 3 trackers spread out around him, all of them silent, all of them reading the same strange signs in the dirt. The scent trails were wrong in a way that took him a moment to place. Not a single wolf, not even a small group traveling together. Layered, overlapping trails, some fresh, some days old, circling the quarry's edge like something had been watching, retreating and returning, over and over, for weeks. "Whoever it is," said Edgar, his oldest tracker, crouching low over a partial print in the mud, "they know how to hide their numbers. This isn't a rogue pack passing through. This is reconnaissance." Damien crouched beside him, studying the print, the careful spacing of it, the deliberate avoidance of the softer ground where a clearer track might have formed. Reconnaissance for what? "That," Edgar said grimly, "is the question I can't answer yet." They worked the quarry for another hour, mapping the trails as best they could, and Damien left with more questions than he had arrived with, a familiar and unwelcome feeling given how many other problems already occupied his attention. The northern border had been unusually quiet for the better part of a year, a silence he had once taken as peace and had begun, in recent months, to suspect was something closer to patience. He returned to the pack hall by mid-morning, his mind still circling the quarry, the scent trails, the careful patience of whoever had been watching his territory from its edges. It was Callum who broke his concentration, appearing in the doorway of his study with an expression that told Damien immediately that whatever news he carried was not going to improve his morning. "Ronan Blake requested formal correspondence," Callum said. "He's asking for a meeting. Says it concerns matters of mutual interest along the shared border." Damien's jaw tightened at the name. Ronan Blake led the neighboring territory to the east, a pack that had spent the better part of a decade positioning itself as an ally, while quietly testing the edges of every agreement it signed. Damien had never trusted him, not once, not even during the years when their fathers had maintained an uneasy peace between the two territories. "Mutual interest," Damien repeated flatly. "What does he actually want?" "He didn't say, but there's a rumor traveling with the request." Callum hesitated, choosing his next words with visible care. "He's heard about the marking, about the mate who stopped attending the pack gatherings. He's expressed interest in meeting her." Something cold and immediate moved through Damien's chest, an instinct he did not examine closely enough to name, though it settled into his shoulders like a held breath. "Why would Ronan Blake care about a mate I haven't even acknowledged?" "Because everyone in 3 territories knows you haven't acknowledged her," Callum said bluntly, "which makes her, in the eyes of a man like Ronan Blake, unclaimed. And unclaimed bloodlines are exactly the sort of thing an ambitious alpha finds interesting, especially one bordering a territory he's spent a decade testing." Damien said nothing for a long moment, staring at the map spread across his desk, at the quarry marked in red ink, at the eastern border where Ronan Blake's territory pressed close against his own. The idea of Lena Voss, standing quietly by her pillar for 3 years while he ignored her, being noticed instead by a man like Ronan Blake, sent a wave of something sharp and unfamiliar through him, something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. "Arrange the meeting," he said finally, "but keep it to border matters, nothing else." Callum studied him for a moment longer than necessary. "As you wish, Alpha." The meeting took place 3 days later, in the neutral hall that sat exactly on the boundary line between the two territories, a building constructed generations ago specifically to prevent either side from claiming home advantage. Ronan Blake arrived with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that came from never having lost anything he actually wanted, and Damien disliked him within the first 30 seconds of the meeting, as he always did, though this time the dislike sat sharper than usual. They discussed the border for the better part of an hour, the scent trails near the quarry, the increased patrols on both sides, the strange silence that had settled over the shared boundary in recent months. Ronan answered every question smoothly, offered nothing of real substance, and Damien found himself watching the other alpha's easy manner with growing suspicion. It was near the end of the meeting, as the formal business wound down, that Ronan finally shifted the conversation with the casual precision of a man who had been steering toward this exact moment the entire time. "I hear congratulations are in order," Ronan said, leaning back in his chair with an expression of polite curiosity. "A marking. 3 years passed, and yet I've never once seen your mate at any gathering our territories have shared. Strange, wouldn't you say, for a bond as significant as that to go so publicly unacknowledged?" Damien's expression did not change, though something behind his eyes went very still. "Territory matters are the subject of this meeting, Blake, not personal ones." "Of course. Forgive my curiosity." Ronan's smile did not falter, though his eyes carried a sharpness that suggested the apology meant nothing at all. "It's simply that I've heard interesting things about her bloodline. Old things. The kind of history that tends to make an alpha curious about a woman his neighbor seems determined to ignore." The room went very quiet. Damien felt the words land somewhere deep and unwelcome, an old instinct rising in him that he had not felt in years. Sharp and possessive and entirely unwanted, given how carefully he had trained himself away from wanting anything at all where Lena Voss was concerned. "Whatever you've heard," Damien said, his voice low and controlled in a way that took considerable effort, "is not your concern." "Isn't it?" Ronan's smile widened, just slightly, just enough to make the challenge in it unmistakable. "An unclaimed bond sitting on the edge of my border is very much my concern, Ashgrove, especially when the woman in question carries blood old enough to matter to more than one territory. I'd hate for a misunderstanding to arise, simply because you've been too busy to notice what you have." Damien rose from his chair before he fully decided to, the movement sharp enough that Callum, standing quietly near the door, straightened in immediate alertness. "This meeting is concluded," Damien said, his voice carrying the particular authority that had ended arguments long before this one. "Border matters only, going forward. Anything else, and I'll consider it an act of provocation." Ronan rose as well, unhurried, still smiling, entirely unbothered by the warning. "Understood, Alpha King, though I'd think carefully about what you're actually protecting, and whether ignoring it is truly the wisest strategy." The journey back to the pack hall passed in near total silence. Damien's jaw set so tightly that Callum did not attempt conversation until they were well within their own borders again. "He's testing you," Callum said finally. "Testing whether Lena Voss is truly unclaimed, whether there's an opening there he can exploit, either through the bloodline itself or through the border tensions that would come from claiming an unacknowledged mate. I know what he's doing. Then you also know that ignoring her further only makes his position stronger. An alpha who won't claim his own mate hands his rivals exactly the kind of weakness they're looking for." Damien said nothing, staring out at the passing tree line, at the quarry visible faintly in the distance, at the whole tangled mess of borders and threats and old, buried feelings he had spent 3 years trying not to examine too closely. Ronan Blake's words sat in his chest like a splinter, sharp and impossible to ignore now that he knew it was there, and beneath the anger at the other alpha's insinuations sat something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with strategy or borders or territorial pride. He thought of the empty pillar corner at the last 2 gatherings, of the green dress that had not appeared, of a bond he had spent 3 years refusing to acknowledge finally slipping toward a danger he had never once considered, until a rival alpha's smile had made the stakes suddenly uncomfortably clear. For the first time in 3 years, Damien Ashgrove found himself wondering, with an urgency that surprised him, exactly where Lena Voss was, and whether it was already too late to matter. Lena had not expected to see Damien Ashgrove at the edge of the archive that afternoon, and she certainly had not expected the particular intensity with which he was watching the front door, as though he had been standing there for some time trying to decide whether to enter at all. She was carrying a stack of old ledgers back to the records room when she spotted him through the front window, and her first instinct was simple disbelief, followed quickly by a strange lurch of nerves she resented immediately. 3 years of being invisible to this man, and here he was, standing outside the pack archive in the middle of a working afternoon, looking like a man who had lost an argument with himself and come out the other side anyway. She set the ledgers down carefully and walked to the door before she could talk herself out of it. "Alpha," she said, keeping her voice even, the same tone she used for pack officials requesting old records, nothing more, nothing less. Damien's eyes met hers directly for the first time in longer than she could measure, and something in his expression flickered, uncertain in a way she had never once seen on him before. "Miss Voss," he said, and the formality of it landed strangely between them, given the mark still glowing faintly silver on both their wrists. "I wondered if you had a moment." "I have several moments. I work here." She kept her tone light, though her pulse had picked up in a way she found deeply irritating. He hesitated at the threshold, and Lena found herself, despite everything, curious about what could possibly bring the Alpha King to her doorstep after 3 years of careful, deliberate distance. She stepped back, holding the door open, and after a beat he followed her inside, glancing around at the tall shelves of records with an expression that suggested he had never once considered what her actual life looked like until this exact moment. "You've missed the last 2 gatherings," he said, once the door had closed behind them. "I have. May I ask why?" Lena studied him for a long moment, weighing the question, weighing 3 years of silence against the sudden, unexpected fact of his presence in her workplace. "My grandmother has been ill," she said finally. "I had somewhere more important to be." Something in his expression shifted at that, guilt perhaps, though it passed too quickly for her to be certain. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Are you?" The words came out sharper than she intended. 3 years of quiet resentment finding an unexpected outlet. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe, given that you've never once asked me a single question about my life in 3 years of marking." Damien's jaw tightened, though he did not look away, and something about that steadiness surprised her more than his sudden appearance had. "You're right to doubt it," he said. "I haven't earned the right to ask about your grandmother, or anything else about your life. I know that. Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Lena wondered if he intended to answer at all, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness she had never heard from him before. "Not once, not even on the night of the marking. Because your absence has made me realize how little I actually know about you," he said. "And because a man tried to use that ignorance against me 3 days ago, and I found I didn't have a single answer to give him." Lena's arms crossed instinctively over her chest, an old defensive habit she had built over years of standing alone by pillars. "What kind of man?" "Ronan Blake. He leads the territory east of ours." Damien's expression darkened at the name, and Lena filed away the reaction for later consideration. "He's expressed interest in you, in your bloodline specifically. He seems to know things about your family history that I don't." The mention of her bloodline sent a small jolt through her, memories of her grandmother's bedside revelations rising unbidden, and she wondered, with sudden unease, how a rival Alpha 2 territories away could possibly know anything about a secret her own grandmother had only just shared with her. "What exactly does he know?" "I don't have specifics, only that he called your line old and significant, and that he seemed entirely too pleased at the idea of an unclaimed bond sitting on my border." Damien's jaw worked, an old, unfamiliar tension settling into his shoulders. "I came here to warn you. And to ask, honestly, why you stopped attending the gatherings, because I find I need to know." Lena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the particular coldness she had grown used to over 3 years, and found instead something closer to genuine unease, an emotion she had never once seen him display in public. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "I stopped attending," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "because I got tired of standing next to a pillar for a man who spent 3 years pretending I don't exist. That's the whole truth of it, Alpha. Nothing more complicated than that." The words landed visibly, something flinching behind his eyes, and for a moment Lena almost regretted the bluntness of it, almost, until she remembered exactly how much of her own dignity she had spent standing quietly in ballrooms, waiting for a man who never came. "I deserve that," Damien said finally, quietly. "You did." They stood in silence for a long moment, the archive stillness settling around them, dust motes drifting through the afternoon light slanting in from the tall windows, and Lena found herself, despite 3 years of careful armor, curious about the man standing in front of her, the one who had never once bothered to look this closely at anything before. "I won't pretend 3 years can be undone with a single conversation," Damien said eventually, "but I would like to understand, properly, what Ronan Blake might be after, and I would like to make sure you're protected, regardless of anything else between us." "Protected from what, exactly?" "I don't know yet, that's what concerns me." His eyes met hers, steady now, more focused than she had ever seen them. "Will you tell me about your bloodline, whatever you know of it?" Lena hesitated, her grandmother's careful, private revelations sitting heavy in her chest, warnings about the packs that might come looking for old blood, and found herself reluctant to hand any of it over to a man who had spent 3 years demonstrating exactly how little he could be trusted with things that mattered. "Not today," she said finally. "Maybe not ever. until you've earned considerably more trust than you currently have. Something that might have been respect flickered across his face at that, an acknowledgement that she had not expected. That's fair, he said, more than fair. He left not long after, the conversation trailing off into careful, formal goodbyes, and Lena stood by the archive's front window long after he had gone, watching the empty street where he had been standing, turning over the strange new shape of an afternoon that had changed something between them, without either of them quite agreeing to it. That evening she visited her grandmother again, finding Marta a little stronger than the previous week, sitting up in her chair by the fire with color returned to her cheeks. Lena told her about Damien's visit, about Ronan Blake's interest in the bloodline, watching her grandmother's expression carefully as she spoke. Marta's face grew serious, the warmth fading into something closer to alarm. Ronan Blake, she repeated slowly. That name carries old weight in certain circles, Lena. His family has hunted bloodlines like ours before, generations back, long before either of us was born. Hunted them for what? For the same reason any ambitious alpha hunts power he doesn't already possess. Marta's hand found Lena's, gripping it with more strength than her illness should have allowed. You must be careful, granddaughter, more careful than you've ever needed to be. The gift in your blood is not simply a family curiosity anymore, not if men like Ronan Blake have already caught its scent. Lena sat with her grandmother long into the night, the fire burning low, both of them quiet with the weight of a danger that had arrived faster and closer than either of them had prepared for, and somewhere beneath the fear, a small and unexpected thread of something else, cautious and unfamiliar, wound itself around the memory of Damien Ashgrove standing in her archive doorway, looking at her, finally, as though she were real. The third gathering Lena missed fell on a night when the whole territory seemed to be holding its breath, word of the border tension having spread quietly through the pack in the careful, half-whispered way that serious news always traveled. She stayed home that evening, curled into the corner of her small couch with a cup of tea gone cold beside her, staring at nothing in particular, while her thoughts circled endlessly around bloodlines and rival alphas, and a man who had finally looked at her properly after 3 years of nothing at all. A knock at her door just past 9 startled her out of the spiral, and she opened it to find Nora standing there, breathless, her expression tight with the particular urgency of someone who had run most of the way. You need to hear this before someone else tells you a distorted version, Nora said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Ronan Blake was seen near the eastern edge of your grandmother's property today. 2 of his trackers, actually, walking the tree line like they were mapping it. Lena's stomach dropped, the cold tea forgotten entirely as she reached for her coat. Near Marta's house? Are you certain? Certain enough that Damien's people caught them and escorted them back across the border within the hour. But yes, they were there, Lena, and they weren't exactly subtle about it. Lena was out the door within minutes, Nora trailing behind offering to come along, an offer Lena waved off with a distracted assurance that she would be fine, that she needed to see her grandmother's safety with her own eyes before she could think clearly about anything else. The walk to the cottage felt longer than usual, every shadow along the tree line taking on a weight it had never carried before, and by the time she reached the gate her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Marta was safe, thankfully, sitting by the fire exactly as she had left her the previous evening, though Edith reported with visible unease that strange men had indeed been seen near the property's edge, earlier that day, gone before anyone could get close enough to question them directly. They were looking for something, Marta said quietly, once Lena had settled beside her, breathless and shaken. Or someone. I don't think it's a coincidence, granddaughter, that this happened so soon after you spoke with the Alpha King about your bloodline. You think Damien told him? I think Ronan Blake has his own sources, and I think whatever caution Damien Ashgrove is finally showing you has come rather later than would have been useful. Marta's voice carried no real anger, only a tired kind of resignation. But it hardly matters now who is to blame. What matters is that they know where to find you, and where to find me, and that neither of us can afford to be caught unprepared again. Lena spent the night at the cottage, unwilling to leave her grandmother alone given the day's events, and it was near dawn, in the gray half-light before sunrise, that a knock at the cottage door brought both women upright in alarm. Edith answered it cautiously, and returned a moment later with an expression of visible surprise. It's the Alpha King, she said. He's asking to speak with you both. He says it's urgent. Damien stood at the threshold, looking as though he had not slept, his expression carrying a tightness Lena had never once seen on him, not even during the tensest moments of the pack gatherings she had endured for 3 years. 2 of his trackers stood a respectful distance behind him, and beyond them, visible in the pale morning light, several more of his people were positioned along the tree line surrounding the cottage. I heard what happened here yesterday, he said, once Marta had waved him inside and settled him near the fire. "I came to make certain you were both safe, and to offer protection going forward, if you'll accept it." "Protection," Marta repeated, her tone carrying a skepticism that made Damien's jaw tighten further. "From the Alpha King who ignored my granddaughter for 3 years. I know I have no right to ask for your trust," Damien said, and something in his voice carried a rawness Lena had not expected, an honesty that seemed to cost him considerable effort. "But Ronan Blake's interest in your bloodline is now a threat to this entire territory, not simply a personal matter between myself and Lena. I would offer protection regardless of our history, because it is my duty as Alpha, but I would also ask, honestly, for the chance to make up for what I've failed to do these past 3 years." Marta studied him for a long moment, her sharp eyes missing nothing, and Lena found herself holding her breath, uncertain what her grandmother would say, uncertain what she herself wanted the answer to be. "Sit down properly then," Marta said finally, gesturing at the chair across from her with the particular authority of a woman who had never once been intimidated by rank. "If you intend to offer protection, you had better understand exactly what it is you're protecting." Damien sat, and Marta began to speak, slower and more carefully than she had with Lena alone, weaving the story of the old bloodline with details she had withheld even from her own granddaughter. Details about the founding pacts and the ancient balance that had once depended on gifts like the one sleeping in Lena's blood. Damien listened without interruption, his expression growing steadily more serious as the story unfolded, and by the time Marta finished, the morning light had fully risen outside the small windows, gilding the room in gold. "If Ronan Blake believes this gift is real," Damien said slowly, once Marta had finished, "he won't stop at watching from the tree line. Men like him don't gather information for curiosity's sake." "No," Marta agreed. "They gather it to act." Damien's eyes found Lena's across the small room, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with marks or bonds or 3 years of careful distance, something closer to a shared understanding of the danger now settling over both their lives. "I would like to place formal guards on this property," he said, "and I would like Lena to consider staying closer to the pack hall, at least until we understand the full scope of what Blake wants." "You want me under your protection," Lena said, her tone carrying more challenge than agreement. "I want you safe," Damien said simply. "Whatever that requires, and however little right I have to ask it of you." Lena did not answer immediately, the weight of the morning pressing down around her, the fear for her grandmother's safety tangled uncomfortably with 3 years of resentment that had not simply evaporated because a man had finally shown up when it mattered. But beneath the resentment, something else had begun to shift, small and cautious, a recognition that the version of Damien Ashgrove sitting across from her grandmother's fire was not quite the same man who had turned and walked away from her on the night of the marking. "I'll think about it," she said finally, and it was, she realized, the most honest answer she had to give. Damien left guards posted discreetly around the cottage's perimeter before he departed, promising to return within a few days with a more permanent arrangement, and Lena watched him go from the cottage window, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and fragile, unfamiliar hope she did not yet trust enough to name. 3 days later, word arrived that Ronan Blake had requested a second meeting, this time formally, this time explicitly regarding what he called a matter of significant mutual interest concerning bloodlines and border security, and Damien found himself staring at the request with a cold certainty settling into his chest that whatever peace had held between their territories for the past decade was about to end, one way or another, and that the woman he had ignored for 3 years now stood squarely at the center of it. The second meeting with Ronan Blake took place not in the neutral hall on the border, as protocol demanded, but in the Ashgrove Pack Hall itself, a deliberate choice on Damien's part meant to signal exactly whose territory this conversation would be conducted on. Ronan arrived with a wider entourage than before, 4 of his senior wolves flanking him, and Damien noted with grim satisfaction that the other alpha's easy smile had thinned considerably since their last exchange. "You've placed guards on an old woman's cottage," Ronan said, dispensing with pleasantries almost immediately. "That seems like an unusual response to simple curiosity, Ashgrove." "Your trackers were seen mapping the tree line around a private residence," Damien said evenly. "That seems like an unusual response to simple curiosity as well, wouldn't you agree?" Ronan's smile tightened, though it did not disappear entirely. "I prefer to think of it as due diligence. My territory has old ties to certain bloodlines, ties that predate your family's rise to power in this region. I have every right to investigate matters that concern my own history. Her bloodline is not your history, it's her family, and it falls under my protection, formally, as of this morning." Damien's voice carried a flat, absolute authority that left no room for negotiation. I would ask you to make that very clear to whoever sent your trackers to her grandmother's property." The room went still, every wolf present understanding the weight of what Damien had just declared, a formal claim of protection that amounted to nearly the same thing as acknowledging the mate bond itself, without quite crossing that final line. Ronan's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, and Lena, standing quietly near Callum at the edge of the room where Damien had insisted she be present for this exact moment, felt the shift in the air as clearly as everyone else did. "Protection," Ronan repeated slowly. "That's an interesting word for a man who spent 3 years demonstrating precisely the opposite toward the woman in question. My history with Lena Voss is not the subject of this meeting." "Isn't it?" Ronan's gaze shifted, deliberately, toward Lena herself, and something in his expression made her skin crawl, a calculating hunger that had nothing to do with attraction, and everything to do with what her blood represented to him. "Perhaps the lady herself would like to weigh in. 3 years of neglect is a long time, Miss Voss. Long enough perhaps to consider whether protection offered this late is protection at all, or simply a king realizing too late what he stands to lose." Every eye in the room turned toward Lena, and she felt the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders. An opportunity, she realized suddenly, that Ronan Blake had engineered deliberately, hoping to drive a wedge between her and Damien, at exactly the moment unity mattered most. She stepped forward, her chin lifted, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that her voice came out steady. "I don't need anyone to weigh in on my behalf, Alpha Blake. I'm capable of speaking for myself, and I'll tell you plainly that whatever history exists between myself and Alpha Ashgrove is a private matter that has nothing to do with your interest in my family's bloodline." "A diplomatic answer," Ronan said, his smile sharpening, "but not an answer, really." "It's the only answer you're entitled to." Lena held his gaze without flinching. 3 years of standing silently by pillars having taught her, apparently, a kind of quiet steel she had not fully appreciated until this exact moment. "My bloodline is my family's business. My safety is under the Ashgrove Pack's protection, formally, as of today. Anything else you're hoping to extract from this conversation, you won't find it here." Something flickered across Ronan's expression, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect, quickly buried beneath his usual composed arrogance. Bold words for someone who spent 3 years standing quietly by a pillar. "People change," Lena said simply, "especially when they stop waiting for someone else's permission to matter." The meeting concluded shortly after, with no formal agreement reached beyond a mutual, uneasy acknowledgement that both territories now understood exactly where the other stood, and Ronan Blake departed with considerably less confidence than he had arrived with, though his parting glance toward Lena carried a warning neither she nor Damien mistook for anything but exactly what it was. Once the hall had emptied, Damien turned to her, something in his expression carrying a mixture of concern and an admiration he did not quite manage to hide. "You didn't need to face him alone like that." "I wasn't facing him alone," Lena said. "I was facing him on my own terms. There's a difference, and it matters to me." "Fair enough." He studied her for a long moment, the pack hall emptying around them, and something passed between them that felt, for the first time, less like the aftermath of 3 years of hurt, and more like the beginning of an actual conversation between two people who had never properly had one. "Thank you for handling that as well as you did. I didn't do it for you," Lena said, though there was less sharpness in it than there might have been a month earlier. "I did it because it's my life, and my family, and I'm done letting other people decide what happens to either." Damien nodded slowly, something in his expression shifting further, an understanding settling into place that seemed to cost him considerable pride to accept. "I owe you more than an apology for 3 years of silence," he said. "I know that. I don't expect it to be repaired quickly, or easily, or simply because a rival Alpha forced my hand into finally paying attention. No," Lena agreed. "It won't be, but I appreciate you saying it plainly at least." They stood together in the emptying hall a moment longer, the tension of the meeting slowly draining out of the room, and Lena found herself, despite every reasonable instinct built over 3 years of careful self-protection, considering the strange possibility that the man in front of her might actually be trying, honestly, to become someone worth the mark on her wrist. That evening, back at her apartment, Nora arrived with a bottle of wine and an expression of barely contained excitement. "I heard what happened," she said, pouring 2 glasses before Lena had even taken off her coat. "Everyone's talking about it. The way you stood there, the way you shut Ronan Blake down without breaking a sweat. People are saying things about you they never said before." "What kind of things?" "Good things, Lena. Respect, mostly. It turns out standing up for yourself in front of an entire pack hall makes an impression." Nora grinned, handing over a glass, And I heard the Alpha King couldn't stop watching you the entire time." Lena took a long sip of wine, letting the warmth settle through her, and thought, not for the first time, about how strange it was that stepping away from 3 years of quiet invisibility had led her here, standing at the center of a conflict between territories, watched by a man who had finally, belatedly, begun to see her. She did not know yet whether that recognition had come in time to matter, or whether Ronan Blake's interest in her bloodline represented a danger too large for any amount of newly discovered protection to contain. But she knew, with a clarity that surprised her, that whatever came next, she intended to face it as herself, fully, rather than as a shadow standing quietly by a pillar. The weeks following the confrontation with Ronan Blake settled into an uneasy rhythm. Guards stationed quietly around Marta's cottage, patrols doubled along the eastern border, and Lena finding herself, more often than she expected, in Damien's company, as the practical demands of her protection required regular contact between them. It started with brief updates on border security, delivered in careful, formal tones across her grandmother's kitchen table, and gradually stretched into longer conversations neither of them seemed to be actively trying to end. Damien asked questions now, real ones, about her work in the archive, about her grandmother's garden, about the small details of a life he had spent 3 years ignoring entirely. And Lena found herself answering more freely than she expected, some old wall inside her cracking slowly under the weight of his sustained, deliberate attention. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, weeks into this new and careful rhythm, that Lena finally asked the question she had been avoiding since the archive conversation. "Why did you walk away?" she said, setting down her tea, watching him carefully across the small table. "That night, at the marking. You looked at me once and then you left. 3 years, and you never once explained it." Damien's expression shifted, something guarded and old surfacing behind his eyes. And for a long moment Lena thought he might deflect the question entirely, the way he had every other time it had come dangerously close to the surface. But instead he set down his own cup, his jaw working, and began to speak in a voice quieter than she had ever heard from him. "My mother was an Alpha's mate," he said slowly, "a bond marked young, celebrated across 3 territories, and when my father died in a border conflict, protecting land he'd sworn to defend, my mother didn't survive the grief. She simply stopped. Over the course of a year, fading in ways no healer could explain or reverse." Lena's chest tightened, understanding beginning to form even before he finished. "I was 12, Damien continued. "Old enough to understand what I was watching, too young to do anything to stop it. I decided, somewhere in that year of watching my mother disappear, that I would never let myself become vulnerable to that kind of loss, that a king who loved too openly handed his enemies exactly the weapon they needed to destroy him." His eyes met hers, raw now, stripped of the careful control she had grown used to. "When the mark appeared on your wrist, I panicked. Not because of you, Lena. Because of what wanting you would mean. What it would cost me if I ever lost you the way my father lost my mother." The silence that followed sat heavy between them. 3 years of hurt and confusion suddenly reframed in a light Lena had never once considered, and she found herself, despite everything, aching for the boy who had watched his mother fade, and decided, far too young, that love itself was the danger, rather than the loss that followed it. "That doesn't excuse 3 years, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. "You could have told me this. You could have given me something, anything, instead of silence." "I know." Damien's voice carried no defensiveness, only a quiet, difficult honesty. "I told myself silence was safer, for both of us. I told myself I was protecting you from a king who couldn't afford to love anyone properly. I see now how much of that was simply fear wearing the mask of protection. But it reshaped it, made it something she could finally hold without it cutting quite so deeply. "I'm not asking you to fix 3 years in a single afternoon," she said eventually, "but I need you to understand that I'm not the same woman who used to stand quietly by that pillar hoping you'd notice her. I've stopped waiting for anyone's permission to matter, including yours." "I understand that," Damien said. "I think it's the thing I respect most about you, actually. That you didn't wait around forever for a coward to find his courage." Something in his tone, the honesty of it, the lack of any attempt to soften his own failures, cracked something further open in Lena's careful armor, and for the first time in 3 years she allowed herself to consider, seriously, the possibility that the man in front of her might actually be capable of becoming someone worth trusting with the mark on her wrist. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices outside, and both of them rose sharply, moving to the window in time to see 2 of Damien's guards restraining a stranger near the cottage's edge. the man struggling against their grip with a wild, cornered energy that immediately put Lena on edge. Damien was outside within seconds, Lena close behind him despite his sharp instruction for her to stay inside, and the guards dragged the stranger forward into the afternoon light, his face pale and sweating, his eyes darting between Damien and the cottage with obvious panic. He was found circling the property, one guard reported, carrying tracking equipment, says he's not affiliated with Blake's territory, but his scent says otherwise. The stranger's eyes found Lena's, and something in his expression shifted, calculation replacing panic, and before anyone could react he lunged, not toward Lena but toward the small satchel at his hip, reaching for something the guards had apparently failed to search thoroughly enough. Damien moved faster, closing the distance in a single powerful stride, wrenching the satchel away before the stranger could open it, and the resulting struggle was brief and decisive, the guards restraining the man fully within seconds while Damien examined the satchel's contents with a growing, grim understanding. "Vials," he said, holding one up to the light, a strange, faintly glowing liquid contained within. "This isn't tracking equipment, this is something else entirely." Lena's stomach turned cold as she stared at the vial, some instinct deep in her blood recognizing the substance even before her mind could name it, a recognition that felt uncomfortably tied to the old, sleeping gift her grandmother had described. "What is it?" she asked quietly. The stranger, restrained and cornered, finally spoke, his voice carrying a bitter, defeated edge. "A suppressant, meant to dull whatever old blood runs through your veins before it can fully wake." His eyes met Lena's, something almost like pity flickering across his face. "Blake wanted it contained before it became too strong to control. I was only supposed to mark the dosage location. I wasn't supposed to be caught." The words hung in the cold afternoon air, and Lena felt the ground shift beneath her. The danger she had been treating as distant and abstract suddenly close enough to touch, close enough to have very nearly succeeded in silencing something inside her, before she had even fully understood what it was. Damien's expression, when he turned to her, carried a fury she had never once seen from him, controlled but unmistakable, and beneath the fury, something else entirely, a fierce and protective urgency that told her, more clearly than any words could have, exactly how much 3 years of distance had finally, completely collapsed. The stranger, once questioned properly within the pack hall's secure chambers, revealed little beyond what he had already confessed, a low-ranking scout in Ronan Blake's service, sent across the border with vague instructions and a satchel of suppressant vials he had never fully understood the purpose of. Whatever plan Ronan Blake had constructed around Lena's bloodline, this man was clearly only a small, disposable piece of it, and Damien's trackers spent the following days working to uncover the fuller shape of the threat now confirmed to be circling ever closer. Lena, for her part, found herself unable to shake the cold understanding that something inside her blood was significant enough for a rival alpha to attempt suppressing it before it could fully surface, a realization that sat uneasily alongside her grandmother's warnings, and her own growing, unformed sense that whatever gift slept within her would not stay hidden much longer. It was 3 nights after the scout's capture that the gift finally announced itself, in circumstances neither Lena nor anyone else could have predicted. The attack came at dusk, a coordinated strike along the northern border near the quarry, 3 separate groups of unmarked wolves crossing into Ashgrove territory, with a speed and coordination that spoke clearly of careful planning, rather than opportunistic aggression. Damien's forces responded quickly, but the attackers had chosen their moment well, striking during a routine patrol rotation that left the border thinner than usual, and word reached the pack hall within minutes that the fighting had already turned costly. Lena was at the archive when the alarm bells rang, and she was moving toward the pack hall before she had fully decided to, some instinct pulling her toward the danger rather than away from it despite every reasonable impulse telling her to seek shelter instead. She arrived to find the courtyard in controlled chaos, wounded wolves being carried in from the border, healers moving between them with grim efficiency, and Damien himself standing at the center of it, directing reinforcements toward the quarry with the focused intensity of a king managing a crisis he had clearly not fully anticipated. His eyes found hers across the courtyard, alarm flashing sharp and immediate. "You need to be inside, Lena. This isn't—" The ground shook before he could finish the sentence, a tremor rolling through the courtyard that had nothing to do with the fighting at the border, and Lena felt something inside her chest answer the tremor with a pull so sudden and overwhelming that she nearly lost her footing entirely. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice strange even to her own ears. "Something's happening, and it's not just the attack." Callum arrived at a run, his expression tight with fresh alarm. "The eastern flank has broken through near the old well. There's something with them, Alpha, not wolves. something none of the trackers can identify. It's spreading a kind of fog that's disorienting everyone who gets close. Damien's expression hardened further, and he turned to issue new orders. But Lena found herself moving instead, drawn toward the courtyard's edge and the direction of the old well. That same overwhelming pull growing stronger with every step, despite every rational instinct screaming at her to stay behind the pack hall's walls. "Lena!" Damien's voice carried sharp and urgent behind her, but she did not stop, some old and buried certainty rising in her blood that she was needed exactly where she was heading, that whatever fog had spread across the eastern flank was tied directly to the sleeping gift her grandmother had described, and that hiding from it now would only make the coming danger worse. She reached the edge of the fighting to find the strange fog exactly as Callum had described, a thick, disorienting haze rolling low across the ground, wolves stumbling within it, as though their own senses had betrayed them entirely. At its center stood a figure Lena did not recognize, robed and hooded, hands raised in a gesture that seemed to be actively feeding the fog's spread, and something in the old blood pulling through Lena's veins recognized the danger of it instantly, a threat far older and stranger than a simple border skirmish. Damien caught up to her at the fog's edge, his expression a mixture of fury and fear that she had never once seen from him. "You cannot go in there." "I have to," Lena said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her. "Whatever this is, it's tied to the old balance my grandmother described. I can feel it, Damien. I don't fully understand it yet, but I can feel it, and I don't think anyone else can stop it." His jaw tightened, torn between every protective instinct he possessed and the growing understanding, visible in his eyes, that she was not asking his permission, but informing him of a decision already made. "Then I'm not letting you go in there alone." They entered the fog together, and Lena felt the old gift rise inside her fully for the first time. A strange and overwhelming clarity settling over her senses even as the disorienting haze thickened around them. Images and instincts flooding her mind faster than she could process. Ancient knowledge her family's blood had carried silently for generations finally, fully awake. The hooded figure turned toward her as she approached, and beneath the hood Lena caught a glimpse of eyes that held no warmth at all, only cold, calculating purpose. "So the old blood finally wakes," the figure said, voice carrying an unnatural, layered quality. Ronan Blake was wise to fear it. "Who are you?" Lena demanded, her voice steadier than her racing heart. "A servant of an older order than either of your petty territories understand," the figure said. "Sent to ensure this gift never fully matures into what it could become. The founding pacts buried this power for good reason, girl. You would do well to let it sleep." Lena felt the old knowledge in her blood answer the challenge before her conscious mind could form a response, an instinct rising through her chest and down her arms, and she raised her hands without fully understanding the gesture, watching in astonishment as the fog around her began to thin, pulled back as though her very presence unraveled whatever unnatural force sustained it. The hooded figure hissed in evident fury, gathering itself for a final, desperate surge of power, and Damien moved instinctively to shield her, placing himself between Lena and the coming attack with a fierce, protective urgency that told her, more clearly than any words ever could, exactly how far he had traveled from the man who had once turned and walked away from her without a second glance. The fog surged forward, and Lena, without fully understanding how, pushed back with everything her newly awakened blood offered her, the old gift and Damien's fierce protection meeting the darkness together in a single, blinding moment that scattered the fighting figure's power entirely, sending the hooded stranger stumbling backward with a cry of pure, undisguised fear. The hooded figure did not linger to press the advantage it had so clearly lost. It vanished into the thinning remnants of its own fog, retreating toward the border with a speed that suggested whatever power it served had already calculated the cost of staying to fight further, and within minutes the northern flank fell quiet entirely, the unmarked wolves who had accompanied the attack scattering back across the boundary line without their strange commander to direct them. Lena stood in the settling stillness, her chest heaving, the old gift still humming faintly through her veins like an instrument recently played, and Damien turned to her immediately, his hands finding her shoulders with a careful urgency that told her exactly how frightened he had been despite his outward composure during the fighting. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough in a way she had never heard from him. "I don't think so." Lena took stock of herself, surprised to find no injury beyond the exhaustion settling heavy into her limbs. "I don't fully understand what just happened, but I don't think I'm hurt." Callum arrived moments later, surveying the retreating enemy forces with visible relief, his expression shifting quickly to astonishment as he took in the scene before him. The thinned fog, the shaken wolves slowly regaining their bearings, and Lena, standing at the center of it all, with an unmistakable new authority, radiating faintly from her posture. "What in the world just happened here?" Callum said, half to himself. "The old bloodline," Damien said quietly, still watching Lena with an expression that mixed awe with something far more personal. "It's awake, fully awake, from what I just witnessed." Word of the encounter spread through the pack within hours, and by morning the entire territory was speaking of little else, the story growing and shifting with each retelling but always circling back to the same central truth, that Lena Voss, the mate the Alpha King had ignored for 3 years, had stood at the center of an attack no ordinary wolf could have survived, and had turned it back through power no one had known she carried. The pack's regard for her shifted almost overnight, the quiet whispers of pity that had followed her for 3 years, replaced by something closer to respectful curiosity, and Lena found the change unsettling in its own way, uncertain how to hold a version of herself that others now viewed as significant rather than overlooked. Damien called a formal gathering of the pack's senior council 3 days later, and Lena attended at his direct request, standing beside him rather than at the room's edge for the first time in the entire history of their bond. The council chamber was full, every senior wolf in the territory present, and the weight of their attention settled over Lena in a way that made her grateful. Briefly, for 3 years of practice standing quietly under difficult scrutiny. "I have called this gathering," Damien began, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "to address matters that concern the safety and future of this entire territory, and to correct a wrong I have allowed to stand for far too long." The room went very still, every eye moving between Damien and Lena with obvious anticipation. 3 years ago, I was marked to Lena Voss, and I responded to that marking with silence and distance that I have no honest excuse for beyond my own fear, Damien continued, his voice steady, despite the visible difficulty of the admission. "I let personal cowardice masquerade as protection, and I allowed a woman who deserved far better to stand alone at every gathering this pack has held since. That failure is mine, fully, and I intend to correct it, publicly, starting today." A murmur moved through the assembled council, and Lena felt her pulse quicken, uncertain exactly what Damien intended but recognizing, from the set of his jaw, that whatever came next had been carefully considered rather than spoken in the heat of a single emotional moment. "Lena Voss carries a bloodline old enough to have drawn the attention of a rival territory willing to attack this pack directly in an attempt to suppress it," Damien said. "She stood at the center of that attack 3 nights past and turned it back through strength this pack did not know she carried, strength I failed to recognize or protect for 3 years, out of my own fear of losing what I refused to properly claim." He turned to face her fully then, and the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, waiting. "I cannot undo 3 years of silence," Damien said, his voice dropping into something quieter, more personal, though it carried clearly through the still chamber. "But I can promise, in front of this entire council, that I intend to spend whatever years remain to me, earning the trust I forfeited through my own cowardice, if you'll allow me the chance." Lena stood in the weight of his words, 3 years of hurt and the strange, complicated tenderness of the past weeks tangling together in her chest, and she found herself, despite every careful instinct built over years of protecting her own heart, moved by the raw honesty of a man who had finally, completely stopped hiding. "I don't forgive 3 years easily," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, honest in front of the entire council rather than softened for public consumption. "And I won't pretend otherwise simply because you've finally found the courage to speak plainly. But I've watched you these past weeks, Damien, watched you show up when it actually mattered, and I think that counts for something. I think it's worth building on, carefully, and honestly, rather than pretending the past 3 years didn't happen." Something in Damien's expression eased at that, not relief exactly, but a kind of grounded hope that suited him better than the careful ice he had worn for 3 years. "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly, "and more than enough to build on." The council chamber erupted into quiet, murmured conversation, the pack processing the weight of what had just been declared publicly, and Lena felt, for the first time in 3 years, the strange and unfamiliar sensation of being seen, fully, by the man whose mark she carried, in front of the entire world that had once watched her stand alone. The month that followed carried its own steady rhythm, one built on careful honesty rather than the practiced distance Lena had grown used to over 3 long years. Damien sought her out daily, not out of obligation but out of a genuine hunger to understand the woman he had spent so long refusing to see, and Lena found herself, slowly and with considerable caution, allowing the old walls around her heart to soften piece by piece. Her grandmother's health continued to improve, steady and encouraging, And Marta watched the careful courtship unfolding between her granddaughter and the Alpha King with the sharp, knowing satisfaction of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize genuine change from convenient performance. "He asks good questions now," Marta observed one afternoon, watching Damien's retreating figure through the cottage window after another visit spent discussing border security and, increasingly, matters that had nothing to do with politics at all. "The kind that show he's actually listening to the answers." "He's trying," Lena admitted. "I'll give him that much." "Trying is more than you had for 3 years, granddaughter. Don't dismiss it simply because your pride wants a longer punishment." Ronan Blake's territory grew quieter in the weeks following the failed attack, the eastern border settling into a wary, watchful peace as word spread of exactly what had happened near the old quarry, of a bloodline fully awake and a king who had finally, publicly claimed the woman carrying it. Whatever ambitions Ronan Blake still harbored, he seemed, for the moment, unwilling to test them further against a territory now visibly united, rather than divided by old wounds. The gift in Lena's blood continued to reveal itself slowly, in small and startling ways, and she spent long hours with her grandmother working to understand its shape, its limits, the delicate old balance it was tied to, a process neither of them expected to complete quickly, but that both approached with a patient, careful curiosity that felt, finally, like building something rather than simply surviving it. It was on the evening of the next scheduled pack ball, nearly 2 months after Lena had first stopped attending, that she found herself once again standing before her closet, considering the same green dress she had worn to countless gatherings over 3 years of quiet invisibility. She dressed slowly, deliberately, and arrived at the pack hall not early, not hovering nervously near the entrance, but at a pace entirely her own, and the room's reaction to her arrival carried none of the careful indifference she had grown so painfully used to over the years. Damien crossed the room the moment she entered, not with the distant courtesy of an alpha greeting a guest, but with the open, unguarded urgency of a man who had spent 3 years learning exactly what it cost to look away. "You came," he said, and something in his voice carried genuine wonder, as though her presence remained a gift he had not fully allowed himself to expect. "I did," Lena said, "though not for the reasons I used to." "No," Damien agreed, his eyes holding hers steadily, without the old careful distance that had defined 3 years of silence between them. "This time you came because you wanted to, not because duty demanded it of you. That's a difference I intend to spend a very long time earning properly." The musicians began to play, and Damien extended his hand toward her, the first time in 3 years he had ever done so, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything that had changed between them, every hard conversation, every fear finally spoken aloud, every quiet act of courage that had brought them to this exact moment. Lena studied his open hand for a long moment, 3 years of hurt and the fragile, careful hope of the past 2 months settling together into something she finally trusted enough to reach for. "I'm not the woman who used to wait by that pillar," she said, placing her hand in his. "I want you to understand that clearly, before we take another step." "I understand it better than you know," Damien said, drawing her gently onto the floor as the music swelled around them, the entire pack watching in a silence that carried none of the old pity, only genuine wonder at the change unfolding before them. "And I promise you, Lena Voss, I will spend every day making certain you never have reason to stand alone again." They danced together for the first time in 3 years of marking, the old silver mark on both their wrists glowing brighter than it ever had before, a quiet confirmation of a bond finally, fully claimed by both sides rather than carried alone. Across the room, Nora watched with tears in her eyes, and Callum allowed himself a rare, genuine smile, and somewhere beyond the territory's borders, word traveled slowly of a king who had finally learned the cost of looking away, and a woman who had discovered, through her own quiet courage, exactly how much she was worth. The pillar by the ballroom's edge stood empty that evening, and it would stand empty at every gathering that followed, not because Lena Voss had stopped attending, but because she no longer needed its shadow to hide within. She stood instead at the center of the room, beside the man who had finally learned to see her, both of them stepping forward together into whatever came next, certain only that neither of them intended to face it alone.